Great Lakes Now, Connect is a co-production of Detroit Public Television and the Nature Conservancy.
Welcome to Great Lakes Now, the algae crisis. I'm Christy McDonald. Last weekend, approximately 400,000 people throughout Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan were given a frightening warning: do not drink the water. The reason? Toxic algal blooms in Lake Erie had poisoned the water supply. Residents were warned not to shower, brush their teeth, or give the water to their pets. Scientists are now saying that this will not be the last algal bloom crisis of its kind. For this half-hour special, Great Lakes Now will explore a few simple questions. What caused this crisis? How do we prevent it from happening again? And what do we do about those algal blooms on Lake Erie? Well, let's take a look at one.
I saw the algae and it was really kind of a neon green. I was surprised at how neon it looked. It is very distinct once you see an algae bloom, and you know you don't want to touch it.
You better not touch it. That's an HAB, a harmful algal bloom. It could make you sick and kill your dog if you are both unlucky enough to fall in. Researchers at Ohio's Heidelberg University have been studying water quality for 4 decades. The team is gathering water samples on streams that feed into the Maumee River, which flows into Lake Erie.
Automatic samplers are set up to take samples 3 times a day, every 8 hours for an entire week. And inside that station is a refrigerated sampler, and every Monday we come out here and exchange the bases.
In the 1960s, pollution and algal blooms almost killed Lake Erie. After that, phosphates were banned in laundry detergent. Phosphorus was reduced and things got better. But in recent years, algal blooms have been making a comeback, and Heidelberg researchers think they've found out why. It's called dissolved phosphorus. It's said dissolved phosphorus is like a power bar for the toxic algae.
If you were to ask 5 years ago, dissolved phosphorus, everybody would scratch their head and go, what's that?
And they now feel that that's really the component, one of the main components in contributing to the algal blooms. We like to think that we know everything that's going on out here, but sometimes it takes a little bit longer term of sampling and database and data analysis to really start to see trends.
Though there are several sources of dissolved phosphorus in Lake Erie, scientists believe most of the problem comes from farm fertilizer.
The other ones all contribute, but the one that contributes the most or puts in the largest portion of the load is agricultural runoff. And so we're trying to get farmers to not apply more than they need and modify the way that they apply the fertilizer. And we think that pretty much those 2 things together will solve the problem.
This year, the Ohio Farm Bureau began promoting ways to better apply fertilizer using the right amount at the right time.
This farm has been in the family since 1890.
The Myers Farm is near Toledo, less than a mile from Lake Erie.
My great-grandfather is the one that first started this. My son's the 5th generation.
Bill Myers says he's been applying fertilizer the way the Farm Bureau recommends for years. It's just common sense, really. It bothers him that farmers are so often blamed for the algal blooms.
The people that will listen to these interviews or read the articles in the paper, the point they don't understand is there isn't some great big pile of phosphorus someplace that the government gives us for free that they say, hey, use all you want. It's expensive. It costs hundreds of dollars an acre to purchase and apply.
Best agricultural practices that reduce harmful runoff can be expensive. That's why programs like this one that help farmers grow cover crops in the fall are so important. Brett Margraf has been using cover crops for years. Still, this is not a common sight in Northwest Ohio, at least not yet. The radishes aren't for eating.
Kind of small.
They're for holding soil, water, and nutrients in place over the winter so they don't get into the lake.
In theory, in the upcoming years, we should see a reduction in what we use for nutrients to grow the same quantity of crop.
Next spring, corn and soybeans will be grown here. Margraf sees it as a small step forward to improve the health of Lake Erie and maybe help his bottom line. And it works for conservationists who are looking at the bigger picture in western Lake Erie.
the complexity of the system, the fact that it is a whole system, requires coordination and cooperation. You know, there's a lot to do at the farm level, but at the end of the day, the impact on the sustainability of the system comes from a large number of farmers and a large number of constituencies working together to achieve sustainability.
And joining me now is Dr. Patrick Doran. He's the Director of Conservation at the Nature Conservancy in Michigan. Patrick, it's good to have you here. We have been talking about algal blooms in Lake Erie for the past several years. There was a huge one in 2011, actually, that didn't even impact the drinking water the way it did just this past weekend. Is what happened this past weekend a wake-up call?
It's absolutely a wake-up call. I guess when I look at this, we've got a really big problem on our hands, and I think it's bigger than any of us realize. It's not a simple problem. You have these huge factors that are coming into play, right? We have climate change, warmer waters, more rain in big events, bringing more stuff in, right? We have our agricultural production, bringing in those sediments and nutrients into the system. We have aquatic invasive species which have made the water clearer so sunlight can get down there, right? And we have all these things kind of coming together. You put the algae in there, it's a great place to grow. We have a warm, shallow lake. It's a great place. If you want to grow plants, do it here, add a little plant food like phosphorus. We're going to have these types of blooms.
So it's happening in Lake Erie, and obviously happened there in the 60s, and it happened there a couple of years ago as well. What is it about Lake Erie that makes it so susceptible to algal blooms, and could it happen anywhere else in the Great Lakes?
Yeah. Again, it's shallow, it's warm, we have these factors coming in. Most of the phosphorus in the Great Lakes, like about 40% of the phosphorus in all of the Great Lakes, is coming into western Lake Erie. So again, shallowest lake, warmest lake, most of the phosphorus coming in there. But again, it's not just a problem in western Lake Erie, it's a problem in Saginaw Bay, it's a problem in Green Bay, and it's a problem in other places throughout the country and throughout the world. We've got to be thinking about these issues.
We've even talked a little bit about possibly Lake St. Clair could be susceptible to it as well.
Absolutely. Again, warm, shallow, phosphorus entering the system.
So when we see this and people are surprised that it starts impacting our drinking water, we need to start taking some next steps.
We shouldn't really be surprised. Again, this was predicted to be a year of not a major algal bloom problem, but you had a coincidence of the drinking water intake valves and the bloom happening right there, whether it was some winds or some currents that got it there. It was just that intersection. So it wasn't supposed to be a bad year, but now 500,000 people are not having drinking water. So we shouldn't be surprised. This is a big problem. It's going to take a long-term solution and dedication. We can't point fingers at one another. Right. It's this industry, it's that part of the thing. We can't do that. We have to start stepping up and say, it's part of me. I need to step up and solve this part of the problem.
All right, Patrick Doran, the Nature Conservancy, thanks so much for joining us. You know, the threat from algae has been known for some time, just what Patrick was talking about. Also, thanks to the research of scientists like my next guest, Jeff Reuter. He's the director of the Ohio Sea Grant at The Ohio State University. Jeff, thanks for joining us. It's good to see you.
Good to be on.
All right, so we're talking about one part of Lake Erie and 400,000 people affected over this weekend, but you believe that other communities are going to be impacted by algal blooms like this in the next couple of weeks, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much a sure thing that other blooms or other communities are going to be sucking in these blooms. It was interesting, the conditions last Friday really led to a lot of algae right over Toledo. But there was a big change over the weekend, and that bloom grew a great deal. And it's now moved out toward the island area. It's covering the shoreline down to about Port Clinton, and it's partially moved into the Central Basin also. And as we look at it, the bloom is going to persist in some locations along the shoreline till December. And the prediction would be that it reaches its greatest severity in September.
So talk to me a little bit about that, Jeff, because we're not even really in the prime season. We will be looking at more September and October is when we've previously seen these blooms that were much larger.
Yes, this bloom will be larger in September than it is right now. And it really grew a lot in the last 3 days. It'll go up and down, but the greatest severity we would predict is going to be in September. By the time you get to late September, the bloom is likely going to be pretty bad out around the island area, but it will be easing in the Toledo area. And by October, the bloom is going to be in the island and Central Basin and pretty much gone from Toledo. And by the end of October, it will be done for the year.
All right, so Jeff, so talk to me a little bit about in terms of the threat for drinking water. So when people hear that things can get worse and move a little bit around the lake, they're thinking, okay, is it going to affect my community? What should communities be doing right now in terms of preparation for that, in terms of drinking water? And then talk to me a little bit down the road. If we can't stop these blooms from happening, do cities have to do some kind of investing in their water supply and water filtration systems to combat this?
Well, we have to do both things. I mean, obviously, we have to reduce the loading of phosphorus to Lake Erie. And we have to reduce the loading of phosphorus and really nitrogen also to all of our freshwater bodies, because these blooms are becoming more prevalent all over the country. In Lake Erie, we know we have the blooms, and we know we're not going to be able to reduce phosphorus as quickly as I'm sure anybody would like. So in the meantime, we have to be able to treat the toxins or treat the algae as they come into the water treatment plants. And that's going to require some type of a treatment that's typically an addition of activated charcoal or carbon of some type that removes the toxin from the water. I believe Toledo spent $4 million doing that last year, and communities should be prepared to do more of that in the future until we get the amount of phosphorus going into the lake reduced.
Is that something that communities have to do immediately, Jeff, or is that something that is going to be down the line? When you talk about $4 million, and a lot of communities don't have that kind of municipal funding, that's a large amount.
Most communities don't have a water intake as large as Toledo. Toledo's in a very bad situation in that it's a large community and it's in the location where the algal blooms will be the worst. Cleveland, for instance, further to the east, is a larger community, larger water intakes, 4 water intakes instead of 1. So Cleveland has the advantage of being able to choose which of the water intakes it wants to use, and it can pick an intake that has lower algae concentrations, but the concentration of harmful algae around the Cleveland area will never be as severe or last as long as it does around Toledo.
All right, Jeff Reuter from Ohio Sea Grant, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
You know, fertilizer, particularly the phosphorus in fertilizer running off into the Great Lakes, has been identified by the International Joint Commission as the primary cause of harmful algal blooms. In a February report, the IJC urged state and local governments to take steps to prevent algae blooms by controlling phosphorus. Those recommendations include, go ahead, take a look, limiting phosphorus runoff, installing best management practices on farms, also addressing urban runoff, restoring coastal wetlands, and also increasing monitoring and research. One of the authors of that report is with me here now. Raj Bhajenkawar, I hope I pronounced that correctly, right, is joining me. Thank you so much, Raj, for joining us. First of all, people may not even know what the International Joint Commission is. Tell us what the IJC is and what your role is in, I guess, really governing the bodies of water around the Great Lakes.
IJC is a binational organization. It's almost 100-year-old. It was between US and Canada, they signed agreement under the Boundary Water Treaty of 1909. So IJC's main role that time was more water quantity related to resolve the dispute between Canada and US, the transboundary water. But in 1972, when we talked about initially at this show, you know, the algae bloom in 60s, that triggered both the US and Canadian government sign a Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 1972, and IJC was key in defining that agreement.
And that agreement was just updated, correct?
Yes, recently updated. And under that rule, Article 7 of the rule talks about IJC should look at upcoming issues in the Great Lakes water basin. So 2011 algae bloom triggered, a commission took this as a priority. And we did 2 years of study, and we just released the report, which you talked about in February.
So we have that checklist that the IJC has put out, the recommendations of what should happen here. In terms of enforcement, where does that lie?
It's mostly on both the governments, both federal governments of US and Canada, as well as state governments, and then comes down to cities and municipalities.
So when you have that list, how do you tackle that? Do you say all 5 of these things or recommendations have to be done at once, or do you have to prioritize and say, well, first off, we're going to make sure that we're going to start looking at farms and the best practices and making sure that phosphorus runoff isn't happening?
So it's a good question. Our report is, if you look at individual recommendation, they are directed to only specific institutes. So for example, we are asking banning state ultimate ban of applying fertilizers or manure in the winter time. Like when the ground is frozen or the farms are covered with the snow, we are asking both state and federal government to outrightly ban that practice. So, and for certain areas, other recommendations, they are very specific to jurisdiction where there is no such policy exist.
So we have this, I guess, this very tenuous balance of best practices and recommendations and things that are actually mandated. And it is up to the state to come down with some kind of mandate or some kind of law saying that you can no longer do these things. Because when you have a situation like this where it does then impact drinking water, people come back and say, well, wait a minute. So who's in charge of making sure that this doesn't happen again? Why is this such a difficult problem to tackle?
It's actually, we had a special workshop in last year. We have experts from all the field, both US and Canadian. Even if you talk about best management practices, there is not a one silver bullet solution. Some best management practices you can apply in Indiana, certain areas where the landscape is different. You can do certain practices. They work really good for certain elements. Most of the BMPs in the past were designed to stop sediment loading from the farm to the creeks and lakes. But some of those best management practices may not work to stop the phosphorus. They sometimes help controlling nitrates. So it's not one silver bullet solution. So we have to work on several issues. For example, I think one of the talk, in the show you mentioned about this right time, right quantity, and right place. That's really, one of the good practices we should apply. And we asked that also in our recommendations. So.
Well, you have to know the conversation is now more intense than it ever has been before. Raj, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Researchers at Michigan State University have been exploring ways for farmers can use less fertilizer to reduce runoff while maintaining those crop yields. Take a look.
Well, it used to be in agriculture, it was all hands-on. You drove the tractors, you manually change things, but now computers have taken a lot of the tedious stuff out.
Jeff Sandburn is a corn, wheat, and soybean farmer in Portland, Michigan, and his job has changed a lot over the years as innovation in agricultural technology has increased at a breakneck pace. And while not all farmers are eager to adopt this new technology, Jeff is.
Farming still is farming. We want to do the best we can with every year we get to farm, and most farmers, I'm going to get maybe 50 tries at this, 50 years of farming, and I only get 50 times to get it right. So I want to keep doing a better job every year and improving what I'm doing.
But it's not just personal pride motivating Jeff. The stakes are much higher when it comes to farming.
We only have so much land that can grow crops, productive crops. And this planet continues to have more people on it. So we have to do a better job on the land we have and get more out of the resources we put in, get higher yields to feed more people.
Unfortunately, pressure to increase food production can have a negative impact on the environment. Over-fertilization and imprecise irrigation have created insecurities in our Great Lakes water supply, including harmful algal blooms.
I think farmers all want to do the best of the environment. They depend on the environment. Their field is part of the environment. The bottom line for most farmers, though, is what does it cost? You want to produce the most corn, soybeans, potatoes you can for the least cost and still maintain the productivity of your soil.
But what if there was a way to increase crop yield and farmers' profitability while decreasing over-fertilization and water waste? At Michigan State University, a team of researchers is piloting a project that will do just that.
The drone, we call it the giant mozzie because it's like mozzie is a nickname for mosquitoes in Australia. I used to work in Australia. It's very, it sounds like a mosquito, but I use it to fly over farmers' field and detect changes in plant performances.
Bruno Basso, an Italian native, has relocated to America's heartland to pilot a new research project using unmanned aerial vehicles, otherwise known as drones.
When a drone flies, like this specific type flies over a field, it detects information about reflectance of light from the plant. So you are able to get an information for a very large area at a fine scale.
Commercial drones have been used by farmers for years to provide a bird's eye view of their crops, and it's estimated that 90% of all drone use by the year 2025 will be in agriculture. But Bruno's drone does much more than take pretty pictures from above. This drone is able to survey large sections of land down to the millimeter, generating detailed maps which lend farmers valuable insight into their fields.
Everything that I do in a field costs me money, whether it's the seed I buy, the fertilizer I use, the chemicals that are applied. If I can get the most efficient use out of that resource, whether it's seed, fertilizer, which fertilizer is very energy intensive, I want to grow the most crop I can out of that given unit of fertilizer.
But increasing the amount of fertilizer does not necessarily mean a farmer will see an increase in the amount of crops he is able to produce. And for Bruno, a uniform application of fertilizer is simply a waste.
So the uniform application that normally a farmer does, by definition, he overestimates this input in one area and he underestimates inputs in the other area. And so that's the important. One size fits all is not the case in agriculture because there is a lot of variability. So in the end, what does the drone do? Tells us about that variability.
Understanding field variability is one part of the puzzle, but for all that information to be useful, a farmer has to know what practical measures to take. That's why Bruno is developing easy-to-use software that not only breaks the information down, it actually creates a predictive model that allows a farmer to digitally test out a change in their farming practices without any risk to their yield.
You can simulate your field, the farmer's field, for the last 20 years of weather that has occurred, that is available, and you compare two nitrogen treatments, 100 kilograms versus 200 kilograms, or more, and you basically, based on the model, which is highly reliable, you basically learn that 80% of the time, 100 kilograms may give you the same response as 200 kilograms, or maybe 100% of the time. So if you get that kind of confidence, why use it 200?
By not using excess fertilizers, we have less runoff, and the runoff goes into the lakes and streams, and then we have algal blooms, which cause eutrophication, and you kill fish. You also, by having excess fertilizer, the bacteria in the soil turn these fertilizers into greenhouse gases. So by using the right amount of fertilizer, so you can maximize plant growth, but not too much, so you get runoff, you can save the environment and produce healthy and efficient crops.
The implications of Bruno's research are clear. Smart advancements in agricultural technology could be the key to increasing farmers' profitability, decreasing the environmental impact, and increasing food production to support an ever-growing global population. And farmers like Jeff, they're ready to take flight.
Use of drones. Joining me now is Tim Davis. He's a molecular biologist at NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab in Ann Arbor. Thanks so much for joining us, Tim. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So we've talked about phosphorus as a cause for these algal blooms. What other factors are we looking at here?
Sure. Well, there are multiple factors that play into these algal blooms. A lot of research has been conducted on looking at the interaction between nitrogen and phosphorus in stimulating these blooms. Nitrogen has kind of been the redheaded stepchild, a nutrient. We don't generally talk about it, but it's there, and it can definitely promote toxicity in certain situations. So even though phosphorus is the main nutrient driving these blooms, we also need to be looking at, what are our nutrient or nitrogen concentrations like? How can we mitigate these? How can we bring the nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations back to a level where Lake Erie is then a healthy ecosystem? So that's just another nutrient that we need to worry about, so that dual management between nitrogen and phosphorus is very important. Also, increasing temperatures due to climate change can definitely make these blooms worse.
You said that you were just out on Lake Erie and doing some testing of the water just yesterday. you said, in fact. And the warning that they put out when people were not able to drink the water in the Toledo area was don't even boil it. And for some of us who have heard water advisories before, we think, oh, if we boil water, then it's safe. Why that recommendation in this situation?
Well, mainly because we're dealing with a compound, microcystin. That's the compound of concern with the Toledo water intake. Now, microcystin is heat stable, right? So if you boil your water, you're not going to destroy the compound. What you could potentially do is you could do the exact opposite. As you boil your water, you'll decrease the amount of water in your pot. As if you boil water long enough, eventually you have an empty pot. Well, what you're doing is you're boiling off the water, but you're concentrating the toxin. So what you're doing is actually concentrating the compound you're trying to get rid of, which can make it more dangerous to ingest. In the last question for you here, you have been working on this for years and talking about algal blooms and trying to combat them, especially in the Lake Erie area. Now we're finally getting an incident where people are paying attention or noticing or saying, hey, we have to do something about this. And at the same time, we're having legislation that could possibly help. Explain that in the next 30 seconds we have. Okay, well, legislation that was just signed into law by President Obama was the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Act. Basically what this does is it mandates funds to study harmful algal blooms, and it specifically mentions on the Great Lakes. So with that legislation, hopefully opening up some funds for researchers to go about their work to understand the ecology of these blooms, along with this recent event that brings public awareness to the severity of these blooms and how they can impact your life even if you don't live directly on the lake. These two events combined should open up some paths to be able to conduct some really nice research. Thanks so much, Tim, for joining us. We appreciate it. You know, it is not the first time that Lake Erie has faced a severe threat to its health. Scientists are quick to remind us, 20 years ago, action by state and federal governments were successful in helping to restore the lake after decades of pollution. So solving the algae problem will take time. The International Joint Commission says if governments act immediately, it could take as long as 9 years before algae no longer poses a threat. Stay with GreatLakesNow.org for updates and for progress reports. For everyone at Great Lakes Now, I'm Christy McDonald. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.